Greetings, YouTubers. It's time to put another good old stale liberal talking point to rest, the Great Depression. Liberals correctly cite President Hoover as the reason the Great Depression got started, but usually the criticism amounts to, he was a Republican, or some would say it was a spending freeze that made it a Great Depression, or Hoover cut taxes, and that's about it. It's quite comical. They'll assert erroneously that Hoover was some sort of Reagan-esque supply-sider and that the stock market crash started the Great Depression. Both are false. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act started the Great Depression as free trade ground to a halt. That was 1930. Hoover also had liberal tendencies. For a strong close, they'll assert that FDR's spend-a-thon brought us out of the Great Depression. That is false as well. Let's look at some facts and figures. When one looks at Hoover's spending compared to deflation and inflation, his spending increases were historically large at the time. If someone tells you Hoover cut spending, rest assured they have not a clue what they're talking about. Hoover's real spending increases were large. In 1929, inflation came in at zero. In the years 1930 to 33, we had massive deflation, so his spending increases were even larger. Hoover also did not cut taxes. In fact, in 1929, those making $6,000.01 were taxed at 3%. $12,000.01 were taxed at 6%. Those making $18,000.01 were taxed at 9%. By 1932, that had gone up to 9%, 11%, and 14%. The tax rate for those making evil big bucks, $100,000.01. Evil rich guys, had jumped from 25% to 56% in the same time frame. Hoover soaked the rich. Look at how more progressive our income tax brackets got. If you liberals would look at them, you'd know. But according to these idiots pulling talking points right from the horse's butt, Hoover enacted a spending freeze, and I've had numerous liberals tell me he cut taxes. There was no such income tax cuts. Didn't happen. As I said before, Smoot-Hawley was a coup de grace. This comes from Walter E. Williams. Says this, let's start at square one. With the stock market crash in October of 29, was this what led to massive unemployment? Official government stats suggest otherwise. So do new stats on unemployment by two current scholars, Richard Vedder and Lowell Galloway, in their book Out of Work. The Vedder and Galloway stats allow us to follow unemployment month by month. They put the unemployment rate at 5% in November 1929, a month after the stock market crash. It hit 9% in December, but then began a generally downward trend, subsiding to 6.3% in June of 1930. That was when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were passed, against the advice of economists across the country who warned of dire consequences. But Hoover was busy trying to buy votes, and so was Congress. 5 months after the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, the unemployment rate hit double digits for the first time in the 1930s. This was more than a year after the stock market crash. Before the Great Depression, it was not considered to be the business of the federal government to try and get the economy out of a depression, but the Smoot-Hawley tariff, designed to save American jobs by restricting imports, was one of Hoover's interventions, followed by even bigger interventions by FDR. For nearly 3 consecutive years, beginning in February of 32, the unemployment rate never fell below 20% for any month before January of 35, when it fell to 19.3%. According to the Vedder and Galloway stats, the stock market crash, which has been blamed for the widespread suffering during the Great Depression in the 1930s, created no unemployment rate that was even half of what was created in the wake of the government interventions of Hoover and FDR. We had another crash, a big economic downturn in 1920, 1921, but the government didn't intervene. And again, I'll have all the links at the right side. Check that out. That's where I'm getting all my material. Check that out. Hoover also had his own housing bubble and was largely responsible for it all by himself. In 1922, Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover launched the Own Your Own Home program campaign. Sounds like a lot like Fannie Freddie, the FHA, HUD. He hailed it as unique. It was unique in the nation's history. Responding to a small dip in home ownership rates, Hoover urged the great lending institutions, the construction industry, the great real estate men to counteract the growing menace of tenancy. Oh my gosh, you're renting. Life's over. He pressed builders to turn to residential construction. He called for new rules that would let nationally chartered banks devote a greater share of their lending to residential properties. It should be up to them. Congress should not push them one way or the other. Congress responded in 1927, and the freed-up banks dived into the market, despite signs that it was overheating. The great national effort seemed to pay off. From mid-1927 to mid-1929, national banks' mortgage lending increased 45%. Isn't that great? Banks are lending to people and they're getting houses. Are we seeing a trend here? The country was becoming a nation of homeowners, the New York Times exulted. As home ownership grew, so did the rate of foreclosures, from just 2% of commercial bank mortgages in 1922 to 11% in 1927. It was already happening. This happened just as the stock market bubble of the late 20s was inflating dangerously. Soon after the October 1929 Wall Street crash, the housing market began to collapse. Defaults exploded. By 1933, some 1,000 homes were foreclosing every day. Financial institutions were exposed as well. Their mortgage loans outstanding more than doubled from the early 1920s to 1930, $9.2 billion to $22.6 billion. One reason that about 750 financial institutions, failed in 1930 alone. Intent on employing this power to boost home ownership after World War II, the federal government passed the GI Bill in 1944, extending a range of benefits to returning veterans, including government-subsidized mortgages. By 1949, 40% of the new mortgages were government-subsidized. Did you hear that? 40%. Are we seeing a trend here that correlates with today? The failure rate on FHA-insured loans spiked fivefold from 1950 to 1960, according to a 1970 National Bureau of Economic Research study. For you liberals, that's not something by the fish tank in the free clinic you hang out at. While the future rate on mortgages made through the Veterans Administration nearly doubled over the same period. By contrast, the foreclosure rate of conventional mortgages barely increased. Hoover also bashed those who opposed intervention in the economy, saying this during his re-election campaign. From President Hoover's 52% increase in government spending to his running the third largest budget deficit then in U.S. history. Oh, he didn't increase spending. Yeah. And from his creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to his signing of the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, Hoover's hyperactive intervention nearly 80 years ago was not very different from Bush's and Obama's hyperactive interventions today. I guess we could say Bush is playing the role of Hoover, although he didn't embrace protectionism, and Obama is playing the role of FDR. Lost my place here. Okay, Hoover himself, campaigning for re-election in October of 32, bragged of rejecting the advice of, quote, reactionary economists who urged that we should allow the liquidation to take its course until it had found its own bottom, end quote. Hoover also fought to keep wages artificially high, which is not the norm during an economic downturn. Roosevelt did many of the same things, but he really put spending and tax increases into high gear. In 1937, we ran a deficit of 2.84% of GDP. The previous 2 years had been over 4%. And we were spending 9.58% of GDP. The previous 2 years were over 10%. In June 1937, the unemployment rate had fallen to 12%. However, the average rate of unemployment for all of 1938 was 19.1%. There you have it, folks. Hoover certainly did not practice supply-side economics. In fact, he was a lot like the president who followed him into office, Franklin Roosevelt. So, folks, when you hear a liberal start blathering about Hoover started the Great Depression and he embraced supply-side economics, cut taxes, cut spending, blah, 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 he had his complete BS. He had his own subprime mortgage bubble. He jacked up spending to levels that had not been seen before then. Remember, this was in peacetime. And he didn't cut taxes. He soaked the rich. So the next time you hear liberals start spouting off these talking points about Hoover, FDR, and the Great Depression, if they start using those talking points, you can rest assured, as I've said, that's a good old stale liberal talking point. It's BS. Don't believe them. Have a nice day. And for you liberals who I just may have corrected your misconceptions about the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, and FDR, don't thank me now.